Get out of my house. Sarah Mitchell stared at her husband as if she had suddenly forgotten who he was. For 25 years, Michael had been the man she trusted with everything. She had stood beside him when his company was nothing more than an idea scribbled across a kitchen table. She had emptied her savings to help him get started. She had sacrificed her own plans, supported his ambitions, and spent years believing that every late night, every missed dinner, and every lonely evening was part of the future they were building together. But tonight, that future was standing in front of her. And it wasn't alone. A woman Sarah had never seen inside their home was standing beside Michael. Sarah looked at her husband. "Michael, what's going on?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said the words that would change her life forever. "This marriage is over." Sarah's eyes moved toward the woman beside him. And suddenly, every unanswered phone call made sense. Every late night. Every business trip. Every time Michael had told her, "It's just work." It had never been just work. He had been seeing another woman. And somehow, Sarah had been the last person to know. She looked around the house they had spent decades building together. The photographs on the walls. The dining table where they had celebrated birthdays. The kitchen where they had once planned their future. And now Michael was telling her to leave. "This is my home too," Sarah whispered. Michael's expression didn't change. Not anymore. Sarah could have screamed. She could have begged. She could have demanded answers. Instead, she quietly walked upstairs and packed one suitcase. But before she left, Sarah stopped in Michael's old office. She opened a cabinet he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small leather folder. She picked it up. And for the first time that night, something changed in her expression. Because Michael had forgotten what was inside that folder. He had forgotten the woman whose handwriting appeared on those documents. He had forgotten who negotiated some of his company's earliest deals. He had forgotten who helped him build the business before the money, before the mansion, and before the woman standing beside him. Sarah took the folder. Then she walked out of the house. Michael thought he had just gotten rid of the wife who had stood in the way of the life he wanted. He was wrong. Because the woman who walked through that door broken would eventually build a life Michael could never control. And 2 years later, the same man who told Sarah she was no longer his family would walk into her office, sit across from her, and ask her for something he never imagined he would need from her. Help. But before we move on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Michael would ever need Sarah again, you have to understand what was inside that folder, and why she chose it over the photographs, the jewelry, and everything else that represented 25 years of her life. Because the folder was a record of where the company had actually started. And Michael had forgotten whose handwriting was on the first page. 25 years before Sarah Mitchell walked out of that house, she and Michael were living in an apartment so small that they could hear everything their neighbors did through the walls. The kitchen had barely enough counter space for 2 people to stand comfortably. The living room contained a worn sofa they had bought second-hand. The bedroom window faced an old brick building across the street. But Sarah loved that apartment because it was theirs. Michael would come home after work, loosen his tie, sit at their tiny kitchen table, and begin talking about the future. He wanted to build a construction and home development company. Not a small company that would survive from one contract to another, but something substantial. Something that could employ people, serve communities, and eventually become a name people trusted. Michael didn't have investors or wealthy connections. He didn't even have enough savings to cover the first project he wanted to take on. What he did have was confidence, determination, and a wife who believed in him. One evening, over a simple dinner at their small table, Michael started describing everything he wanted to give her once the business succeeded. A bigger house, better vacations, a beautiful car. Sarah listened, then reached across the table and held his hand. "I don't need a mansion," she told him. "I just need you." Michael smiled. Because that was Sarah. She didn't measure their future by the things they owned. She measured it by whether they were still together. Sarah was working at a small accounting office during this period, and she had quietly developed a reputation for something Michael didn't fully appreciate yet. She was exceptionally good at dealing with people. She knew how to negotiate without making the other person feel defeated, and she could look at a price and immediately recognize when someone was charging too much. More importantly, Sarah remembered people. She remembered names, birthdays, promises, and small details that most people forgot. Michael was naturally persuasive, but Sarah understood relationships. When he started looking for suppliers for his first construction project, he focused almost entirely on price. Sarah kept reminding him that the cheapest supplier wasn't always the best supplier. You need someone who will still answer your call when there's a problem, she told him. Michael laughed and said he knew what he was doing. Sarah smiled and let him continue. Then Michael found his first serious opportunity. A local developer was willing to give his new company a chance, but the project required materials Michael couldn't afford at the prices being offered. He spent several nights calling suppliers, and every conversation ended the same way. They wanted payment up front. One evening, he came home frustrated and dropped a stack of papers on the kitchen table. "It's over," he said. Sarah looked at him. "What's over?" He told her about the supplier. He had calculated everything several times, and there was no way to make the numbers work. Sarah picked up the papers and studied them. She asked who he had spoken with. She asked what he had offered. Michael explained. She shook her head. "You're asking for a discount." "Yes. That's why they're saying no." Michael looked confused. Sarah explained that instead of asking the supplier to lower the price immediately, he should offer a longer-term relationship. If the first project went well, he should explain the potential volume of future orders and make the supplier feel like they were being invited into something that could grow. Michael listened. Then he looked at her and said, "You think they'll agree?" Sarah smiled. "You won't know until you ask differently." The next morning, Michael made the call using Sarah's approach. The supplier didn't agree immediately. Michael called again. They negotiated. Sarah helped him prepare the numbers and showed him where he could make adjustments without damaging the project. After several conversations, the supplier finally agreed to better terms. Michael came home that evening with a completely different expression on his face. He had secured the materials. The project could move forward. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table when he walked through the door. Michael looked at her and smiled. "I couldn't have done this without you." Sarah smiled back, but she didn't make a big deal out of it. She simply told him, "Then don't forget that we're doing this together." That sentence would become important years later, because Michael would eventually forget it. But there was still another problem. Michael needed money to purchase the first materials, and he had already invested almost everything he had into getting the company started. Sarah knew exactly what that meant. She went into their bedroom, opened the small box where she kept her savings, and brought the money to him. Michael stared at it. Sarah, no. She placed it on the table. You need it. That's your savings. I know. What if this doesn't work? Sarah looked at him. Then we'll figure something else out. Michael pushed the money back toward her. I can't take this from you. Sarah smiled. You're not taking it from me. We're investing in our future. Michael looked down at the money for a long moment. He knew what she was giving up. It wasn't a fortune, but it represented years of saving and planning. Sarah had once dreamed about opening a small bookkeeping and consulting service of her own. She had talked about it occasionally, but whenever Michael's business needed something, her plans were pushed further into the future. That night, she made another choice. She gave Michael the money. And he made her a promise. When this company succeeds, he said, it will belong to both of us. Sarah looked at him and smiled. I know. Michael reached for her hand. I'm serious. Sarah nodded. I believe you. Years later, she would remember those exact words while standing in a hallway being told she no longer belonged in her own home. The project succeeded. Then another one came. Michael's name started appearing in conversations around town. Contractors began calling him. Suppliers remembered him. And Sarah continued helping quietly from the background. She kept the records organized. She negotiated when Michael couldn't. She followed up with people he forgot to call. Whenever he wanted to move too quickly, she reminded him to protect the relationships that had gotten him there. Their apartment eventually became too small for the life they were creating. Boxes of documents filled the living room. Samples of construction materials sat in corners. Sarah joked that their home had become the company's first office. Then, after several successful projects, they rented their first small commercial space. The office was plain, the furniture was inexpensive, and the warehouse was barely large enough for their inventory. But when Sarah walked inside for the first time, Michael stood beside her and said, "Look at what we did." Sarah smiled. "We did this." Michael nodded. At that moment, he meant it. Eventually they welcomed their first child, and the business continued growing. Sarah's own career became less important as she focused more on the family and the company. She told herself she could return to her own ambitions later. There would always be time. Michael needed her now. Their child needed her now. The company needed her now. So she kept putting herself second. Years passed. The company grew beyond anything they had imagined in that tiny apartment. Michael hired employees. They moved into a larger warehouse. He became the face of the company. Clients knew his name. Business magazines began mentioning him. And when people asked how he had built it, he usually talked about hard work, determination, and taking risks. Sometimes he mentioned Sarah. Sometimes he didn't. At first, she didn't mind. She knew what they had built together. She didn't need strangers to recognize it. She only needed Michael to remember. And for a while, Michael did. One evening he stood with her in the backyard of their beautiful new home and wrapped his arm around her. "I told you I'd do it." Sarah leaned against him and smiled. "We did it." Michael kissed her forehead. "You're right. But success changes more than bank accounts. It changes schedules. It changes priorities. It introduces people who weren't there at the beginning. And sometimes, without anyone noticing, it changes the distance between two people. Bigger contracts were coming. Wealthier clients were becoming interested. Michael's name was becoming valuable. And with every new opportunity came another reason for him to spend less time at home. For a while, Michael kept the promise he had made in that small apartment. Then the money started coming in. At first, Sarah believed the changes were simply the price of success. Michael was suddenly responsible for decisions that affected dozens of employees, major clients, suppliers, investors, and projects worth more money than they had ever seen. Their first little office had been replaced by a modern headquarters with glass walls and polished floors. He bought a new car. Then came the larger house. The vacations became more expensive. From the outside, it looked like the promise Michael had made years earlier had finally come true. Sarah would sometimes stand in the doorway of his office and watch him speaking confidently with executives, remembering the young man who once sat at their tiny kitchen table wondering if anyone would ever take his company seriously. For a while, those memories made her smile. But slowly, the success that was supposed to bring them closer began creating a distance neither of them talked about. Michael's schedule became unpredictable. He would leave before breakfast and return late at night. Some days she wouldn't hear from him at all. When she asked about his day, he gave short answers. Meetings. Investors. The project. I'm exhausted. Sarah understood. She had been there from the beginning. So she tried to give him space. When Michael started attending business dinners without her, she told herself those events were probably filled with people she didn't know anyway. When he started buying expensive suits and spending more time in front of the mirror before leaving the house, she smiled and told him he looked good. When he began protecting his phone, Sarah noticed but didn't question it. Michael used to leave his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. Now he carried it everywhere. He took it into the bathroom. He kept it beside him at dinner. He turned the screen away whenever a message appeared. Then one afternoon, Sarah asked him why he had changed his password. Michael looked at her as though she had asked something unreasonable. Because it's my phone, Sarah. She immediately backed away. I wasn't trying to invade your privacy. Michael sighed. I have sensitive business information on there. Clients. Investors, contracts. I can't just leave everything exposed. Sarah nodded. I understand. And she did understand. At least, she tried to. The problem was that Michael's explanations always sounded reasonable when considered separately. There was nothing suspicious about working late when you owned a growing company. There was nothing strange about protecting confidential information on a phone. Every individual change had an explanation. But Sarah began noticing something she couldn't explain away so easily. Michael wasn't simply spending more time working. He was becoming less interested in spending time with her. Their conversations became shorter. Their evenings together became rare. The man who once called Sarah during the middle of the day just to tell her about a new opportunity stopped calling altogether. Sometimes she would send him a message asking if he was coming home for dinner. Hours would pass before he responded. Eventually, Sarah stopped asking. One Friday evening, she decided to surprise him. Michael had always loved the way she prepared his favorite dinner, and Sarah thought perhaps they needed to reconnect with the people they used to be. She spent the afternoon preparing everything. She cleaned the dining room, arranged the table, and even opened a bottle of wine they had been saving. For once, she didn't want to talk about business. She wanted the man who had once sat across from her in that tiny apartment and promised they would grow old together. 7 o'clock passed. Then 8. She checked her phone. No message. 9 o'clock came. Still. Nothing. She called Michael once. He didn't answer. She sent a message. Are you coming home? Several minutes later, his response appeared. Running late. Don't wait. Sarah looked at the table and told herself she would wait anyway. 10 o'clock came. The food was cold. The candles had burned down. At 11, she finally put the food away. Michael walked inside after midnight. He looked exhausted, but Sarah noticed something else. He looked distracted. She stood in the hallway and asked quietly, "Did you eat?" Michael didn't even take off his coat. "I'm exhausted, Sarah. Please don't start." Sarah froze. "Start what?" Michael rubbed his forehead. "Nothing. I'm just tired." She looked at him for a moment. She wasn't angry. She hadn't accused him of anything. She had only asked if he had eaten. Because that was what she had always done. Now even that seemed to irritate him. Sarah lowered her eyes. "I made your favorite dinner." Michael glanced toward the dining room. "I'm sorry." "It's okay. I'll eat tomorrow." Sarah nodded. "Sure." Michael walked upstairs. Without another word. Sarah remained standing there, listening to his footsteps disappear. She looked at the dining table she had prepared so carefully. Then she turned off the lights. It was a small moment, almost too ordinary to remember. But years later, Sarah would remember that night clearly. Not because Michael came home late, but because for the first time, she realized she was beginning to feel like a stranger in her own marriage. Over the following weeks, the distance became harder to ignore. Michael attended events where Sarah wasn't invited. Sometimes he wouldn't return until the early hours of the morning. Sarah tried asking questions without sounding suspicious. Who was there? Which clients were you meeting? His answers became increasingly brief. People from the company. Investors. It's complicated. And whenever Sarah pressed for more, he became defensive. Why do you need to know everything? The question hurt her, because she wasn't asking as an investigator. She was asking as his wife. For 25 years, she had been the person Michael told everything to. She had known when he was worried about money, and when he was afraid the company might fail. Now he was acting as though her questions were an intrusion. Then came the name she would never forget. Victoria. Sarah first noticed it on Michael's phone one afternoon while he was reviewing emails at the kitchen counter. A message appeared on the screen. Sarah wasn't trying to read it. She only saw the name. Because it was large enough to catch her attention. Michael immediately picked up the phone and turned the screen away. Sarah looked at him. Who is Victoria? For a moment. Michael didn't answer. Then he said, she's part of the executive team. Sarah nodded. Slowly. I haven't heard you mention her. Michael locked the phone. She's new. That was all he said. Sarah didn't push. But the name stayed in her mind. Later that evening, she remembered hearing it before. Not clearly. Not enough to prove anything. But enough to make her uncomfortable. She tried one last time to reconnect with him. One evening, she suggested dinner together without discussing work. Michael said he was busy. She suggested the weekend. He said he might have a meeting. She asked if they could take a short trip. He told her he couldn't afford to be away from the company. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. They had spent years working toward financial freedom, and now that they had it, they couldn't find a single free weekend. She finally asked him, Michael, are You happy? He looked surprised. What kind of question is that? Sarah shrugged. I don't know. I just feel like something has changed. Michael stared at her. Then he said, nothing has changed. You're overthinking everything. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted him to put his arms around her and tell her that after all these years, she was still the person he chose. Instead, his phone vibrated on the table. Michael looked at the screen. Sarah watched his expression change. It was subtle, but she saw it. His face softened for just a second. Then he picked up the phone and stood. I need to take this. He walked away. Sarah remained seated. She didn't follow him. She didn't need to. She didn't know who Victoria was. She didn't know what Michael had been hiding. But she knew one thing. She had seen the name before. And this time, she decided to find out who Victoria really was. The first thing Sarah did was stop asking questions. She didn't confront Michael or demand to know where he had been. Instead, she began watching. For 25 years she had trusted him almost completely. She had trusted every explanation he gave her. It's just work. Those words had become almost automatic. When he came home late, it was work. When he missed dinner, it was work. When he traveled unexpectedly, it was work. But now, Sarah started noticing a pattern. The late nights were happening more often. And strangely, Victoria seemed to be present at many of the same events Michael attended. One evening, Michael told Sarah he had another late meeting with investors and might not make it home. Sarah nodded and told him to be careful. Then, instead of going to bed, she waited. Around midnight, no message. Around 1 in the morning, nothing. At nearly 2, Michael finally called. He said the meeting had gone longer than expected and that he was too tired to drive home. He told her he was staying at a hotel near the office. Sarah asked, "Are you alone?" There was a brief silence before Michael answered, "Of course." Then he said, "Good night," and ended the call. Sarah sat there in the darkness, staring at her phone. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the hesitation in his voice stayed with her. The next morning, Michael came home wearing the same suit from the night before. He kissed her on the forehead and walked upstairs. Sarah didn't say anything. Several days later, she found the receipt. It was almost accidental. Michael had left a folder in the car, and Sarah opened the glove compartment looking for something she needed. Beneath a stack of papers was a small hotel receipt. She pulled it out. The date immediately caught her attention. It was the same night Michael had told her he was meeting investors. The hotel wasn't near the company's main office. It was across town. Sarah looked at the receipt. Again. 1 room. 2 guests listed under the reservation. Her hands became completely still. She didn't cry. She didn't call Michael. She simply sat in the driver's seat and stared at it. She remembered their first apartment. Their cheap dinners. The countless nights Michael had come home late and told her, "It's just work." Suddenly those words didn't sound reassuring anymore. They sounded like an answer he had rehearsed. Sarah placed the receipt inside her purse and went home. She acted normally when Michael returned. She prepared dinner. She asked about his day. She didn't mention the hotel. But that evening, she realized something important. If Michael was telling the truth, there should be an explanation. And if he wasn't, she needed to know before she confronted him. So she kept watching. A few days later, while Michael's car was being moved from the driveway, Sarah noticed something underneath the driver's seat. It was a phone. Not Michael's usual phone. This one was older and smaller. Sarah picked it up and stared at it. For several seconds, she considered putting it back exactly where she found it. She knew opening it would cross a line. But another thought stopped her. Michael had already crossed a line she hadn't agreed to. Sarah pressed the power button. The screen lit up. There was no password protecting the message preview. One message appeared. "I wish you would just leave her." Sarah froze. She read the sentence again. Then once more. She didn't need anyone to explain who her was. It was her. The woman who had spent 25 years beside Michael. The woman who had given him her savings when he had almost nothing. The woman who had been waiting at home while he told her he was working. Sarah slowly placed the phone on the table. That single sentence changed everything. But it still wasn't enough for her to understand the entire truth. There was still a part of her that wanted to believe there was another explanation. So Sarah decided not to confront him yet. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. That evening, Michael told her he had another business dinner. He kissed her quickly, picked up his keys, and walked toward the door. Sarah waited several minutes after he left. Then she picked up her own coat, got into her car, and followed him. Michael drove across town, farther from the office than Sarah expected. He eventually stopped outside an upscale restaurant known for attracting wealthy business owners. Sarah parked several cars away and watched him step out. For a few seconds, she expected someone from the company to join him. Instead, another car pulled up. Victoria stepped out. Sarah recognized her immediately from photographs she had seen through company events. Victoria looked comfortable around Michael. Too comfortable. She walked toward him with the confidence of someone who didn't believe she needed to hide. Michael smiled when he saw her. It was a smile Sarah hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. They walked into the restaurant together. Sarah remained in her car, staring through the windshield. But something kept her there. She needed to know how far this had gone. Through the restaurant window, Sarah watched them sitting across from each other. There were no documents between them. No presentation. No executives. No contracts. Victoria reached across the table and touched Michael's hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his. Sarah felt something inside her break quietly. She had spent months explaining away the late nights. But there, through the glass, she finally saw what she had been refusing to see. Michael wasn't discussing business with Victoria. He was building a private life with her. Sarah watched as Victoria leaned closer and said something Michael didn't appear to like. He looked around the restaurant before answering. Sarah couldn't hear every word, but she heard enough when they moved closer to the window. Victoria wanted to know when he was finally going to tell Sarah. Michael told her it would happen soon. Victoria reminded him that he had been saying the same thing for months. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Months. Not days. Not a mistake. Not a single night. Months. Then Michael kissed Victoria. Sarah watched without moving. There was no screaming. No pounding on the restaurant window. No dramatic confrontation. She simply sat there and looked at the man she had loved for 25 years. The hardest part wasn't discovering the affair. It was realizing how long Michael had been living two different lives while she was still protecting the one they shared. And now she understood something painful. Michael had not simply forgotten the promise. He had built a new life in which Sarah no longer had a place. Sarah drove home before Michael knew she had followed him. She walked into the house, removed her coat, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. She had an opportunity to confront him immediately. She could have shown him the hotel receipt. She could have placed the hidden phone in front of him. Instead, Sarah decided to wait. She wanted to hear what Michael would say when he didn't know she already knew. Several hours later, the front door opened. Michael walked inside as though it were an ordinary evening. He put down his keys and glanced toward her. Sarah looked calm, but there was something in her expression he couldn't understand. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't mention Victoria. Instead, she asked one question. "Do you still love me?" Michael stopped. For a moment, he looked genuinely caught off guard. He asked where the question was coming from. Sarah didn't explain. She simply asked him to answer her. Michael hesitated, then told her that of course he loved her. Sarah watched his face carefully. She didn't argue. She didn't expose him. She simply nodded. Because now she knew the answer wasn't true. She had heard him promise Victoria that he would leave his wife. She had watched him kiss another woman. And yet, standing in their kitchen, Michael was still looking directly into her eyes and telling her he loved her. Sarah went upstairs that night without another word. Michael probably believed he had survived another difficult conversation. But Sarah wasn't calming down. She was thinking. And she was beginning to understand that the betrayal was larger than an affair. Because Victoria wasn't simply asking Michael to leave his wife. Within the following week, Sarah discovered that he had been making plans. Quietly, carefully, and without her knowledge. She found information about an apartment he had been looking at across town, paperwork relating to financial arrangements that would separate parts of their shared accounts, and correspondence discussing a much larger role for Victoria inside the company. None of it looked accidental. Michael wasn't simply cheating on his wife. He was preparing for a life after her. And that realization hurt Sarah in a way the affair alone had not. For 25 years she had believed their marriage was the foundation beneath everything they had built. Now she was discovering that Michael had already started designing a future that didn't include her, as though 25 years could be erased with a few signatures. Sarah read the documents carefully, but she didn't confront him. She was afraid that if she did, he would simply deny everything. Then one evening, before Sarah had the chance to decide what to do, Michael confronted her. He walked into the living room carrying a folder of his own. He looked serious. Sarah knew immediately that whatever he was about to say would change their lives. Michael stood across from her and took a breath. "I think we both know this marriage is over." Sarah stared at him. She had imagined hearing those words, but imagining something is different from hearing the person you love say it aloud. Sarah didn't ask whether there was another woman. She already knew. Instead she looked at him and said, "You mean you found someone else?" Michael didn't deny it. There was no apology. No attempt to explain. He simply admitted that Victoria understood where he was going. Sarah felt the weight of the 25 years between them. She thought about the young man who once sat at their kitchen table and told her he wanted to build something. She remembered the money she gave him when they could barely afford anything. She remembered the promise he made when he accepted it. Sarah finally asked the question that had been sitting inside her for years. And after everything I've done for you? Michael looked at her and said, I never asked you to sacrifice your whole life for me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to look away. You didn't have to, she said. I loved you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah hoped that perhaps Michael would finally remember who she was. Instead, he said the words that would stay with her long after he was gone. You stopped being the woman I needed a long time ago. Sarah didn't respond immediately. The sentence cut deeper than the affair, because it reduced 25 years of love and sacrifice to something Michael could simply discard. She looked at him and realized there was nothing she could say that would make him see her differently. He had already made his decision. Victoria had become the future he wanted. Sarah had become the past he wanted to leave behind. Michael told her she needed to leave, as though the sacrifices she had made had never happened. Sarah went upstairs quietly. She opened the closet and began taking out her clothes. There was no screaming. No throwing things. No attempt to destroy the life Michael had chosen. Each item seemed connected to a memory. A dress she had worn on one of their early anniversaries. A photograph from their first family vacation. A sweater Michael had given her years earlier. Sarah placed each item into a suitcase and continued packing. Then, as she looked around the room one final time, she remembered the small leather folder. It was still in the office. The folder Michael had probably forgotten existed. Sarah walked downstairs and entered his office. She opened the cabinet and reached inside. Her fingers touched the leather. She pulled it out and held it against her chest. Michael appeared in the doorway. What is that? Sarah looked at him. Something that belongs to me. He didn't argue. Perhaps he assumed it contained old photographs. He had no idea what was actually inside. The folder contained documents from the earliest days of the company. Old supplier agreements. Handwritten notes from negotiations. Original contracts. Correspondence with vendors. Price comparisons Sarah had prepared herself. Records of conversations she had held with suppliers before Michael had learned how valuable those relationships could become. The folder was not a collection of sentimental memories. It was a record of the company's beginning. And throughout those records was evidence of something Michael had slowly forgotten. Sarah had not simply been the woman waiting at home while he built the company. She had been part of the foundation. But Sarah didn't use the documents that night. She didn't threaten Michael with them. She didn't demand money. She simply closed the folder and placed it inside her suitcase. Michael watched her walk toward the door. Sarah looked back at the house one final time. She had entered that home years earlier believing she would grow old there. She was leaving, knowing that the life she had planned was over. But something else was beginning to take shape inside her. Michael had decided she was no longer the woman he needed. He had decided the company could continue without her. And Sarah finally understood that she couldn't spend the rest of her life trying to convince someone to value what they had already chosen to lose. She walked through the front door carrying one suitcase and the small leather folder. Michael watched her leave, believing the company, the house, the money, and the future would all remain exactly where he had left them. He was wrong. Because Sarah wasn't walking away from her life. She was walking away from the version of it that Michael controlled. She wasn't leaving with the mansion. She wasn't leaving with the company. She was leaving with knowledge, experience, and the one thing Michael could never take from her. The ability to begin again. For the first time in 25 years, Sarah woke up in a bedroom that wasn't hers. She was staying temporarily with her mother, and although her mother welcomed her without asking questions, Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that she had somehow gone backward. At 52, after spending most of her adult life building a family and supporting a successful company, she was starting over with a suitcase beside her bed. Some mornings she would wake up and forget what had happened. Then she would remember Michael, Victoria, and the words that had ended their marriage. For a while, Sarah wondered if he was right. Maybe she had allowed herself to disappear while helping Michael become the man he wanted to be. Her mother noticed the change before Sarah ever spoke about it. One morning she found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, holding the small leather folder. Her mother sat beside her and asked what she was looking at. Sarah explained that these were the first documents connected to Michael's company. She showed her the old agreements, the supplier correspondence, the handwritten calculations. Her mother looked through them carefully. Then she looked at Sarah. "You know what I see?" she asked. Sarah shook her head. Her mother said, "I see 25 years of work that you never gave yourself credit for." Sarah looked down. She admitted that she had always thought of herself as Michael's wife, the mother of their children, and the person who helped whenever he needed her. Her mother reached across the table and said something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "You didn't lose your worth because someone stopped recognizing it." Those words changed something in her. Not instantly. She still had difficult days. But for the first time since leaving the house, Sarah stopped asking herself what she had lost and started asking what she still had. She knew how suppliers worked, how to negotiate prices, and which vendors could be trusted. She had spent 25 years learning an industry without ever calling herself a businesswoman. Michael had stood in meetings and accepted the credit. But Sarah had been doing much of the work that made those meetings possible. Now she wondered what would happen if she finally stepped into the center of her own life. Sarah started small. She rented a tiny office in a modest commercial building. The furniture was second-hand. She had one employee, a young administrative assistant named Rachel, who was willing to take a chance on a business that barely existed. Sarah gave the company a simple name and began making calls. At first, many people didn't take her seriously. Some suppliers recognized her name and asked where Michael was. Sarah learned to answer without bitterness. "Michael is no longer involved. This is my company." Saying those words felt strange at first. Then, slowly, they began to feel powerful. Her first opportunity came from a small contractor who needed materials for a residential project. It wasn't a major order, but Sarah treated it as if it mattered more than anything she had ever done. She negotiated prices, checked delivery schedules, and compared every number twice. She promised a delivery date and made sure the materials arrived exactly when she said they would. When the contractor handed her the payment, Sarah stood outside the building, holding the envelope. The amount wasn't life-changing. But she smiled, because for the first time in 25 years, she wasn't building someone else's dream. She was building her own. One customer became two. Two became four. Rachel began keeping a calendar, because there were finally enough meetings to fill it. Then one afternoon the phone rang. It was a company Sarah had been trying to reach for weeks. They had reviewed her work and wanted to discuss a much larger order, far greater than anything her company had handled. But when Sarah opened the inventory records, the numbers weren't close. If she accepted the contract without securing additional inventory, she could destroy the reputation she had worked so hard to build. If she turned it down, she might lose the opportunity that could take her company to the next level. The following morning she walked into a bank with a carefully prepared business plan, financial projections, and the confidence she had spent months rebuilding. The bank officer looked at the numbers and politely explained that her company was too young and didn't have enough established assets. Sarah thanked him and walked back to her car, where she sat behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. She tried another option. She contacted a supplier and asked whether they could extend her credit long enough to complete the order. The answer was no. Sarah returned to the office and told Rachel the news. Rachel listened quietly before saying what Sarah was already thinking. Maybe we're trying to grow too fast. For a moment, quitting seemed easier than risking everything. Then she remembered Michael's first business, and how many times he had nearly given up during those early years. She remembered sitting beside him at their kitchen table and telling him the same thing over and over. Don't give up. After one bad day. Sarah had said those words to Michael when he had almost nothing. Now she realized she needed to say them to herself. She opened the leather folder again and studied the names until she found one she recognized immediately. Thomas Reynolds. Decades earlier, when Michael was trying to secure materials for his first major project, Sarah had negotiated directly with Thomas. She remembered the conversation because he had initially refused to offer Michael favorable terms. Sarah had spent nearly 2 hours on the phone explaining their situation, comparing prices, and convincing him that the young company deserved an opportunity. She hadn't spoken to him in years. She wasn't even sure he would remember her. Still, she picked up the phone and called the number in her old records. A man answered. Sarah introduced herself. There was silence for a moment. Then Thomas said, "Sarah Mitchell." She smiled. He remembered her. Sarah explained what she was doing and told him about the large order. She didn't ask for charity. She asked him to consider working with her company based on the reputation she was trying to build. Thomas listened carefully. Then he asked one question. Are you still as serious about keeping your word as you were 25 years ago? Sarah answered without hesitation. More than ever. Thomas agreed to help, not because she had a famous husband anymore, but because he remembered the woman who had once convinced him to take a chance on a struggling young company. Sarah arranged the inventory. Rachel organized the deliveries. Sarah personally checked every order before it left the warehouse. The customer received everything on time. No missing materials. No unexplained delays. No excuses. A few days later, the customer called. The representative told her they were impressed. Then came the sentence Sarah hadn't expected. We're recommending your company to another contractor. That recommendation became the first crack in the wall. Another company called. Then another. Sarah hired more employees. The company moved into a larger office. A warehouse followed. Her name began appearing on documents as the owner, not as someone's wife. But she never forgot how close she had come to quitting. Growth wasn't about proving Michael wrong. It was about proving to herself that the woman who had spent 25 years helping someone else build an empire could build something of her own. Michael's life, meanwhile, looked nothing like the one he had imagined. He and Victoria married. There was an expensive wedding, luxury vacations, and the kind of lifestyle he had spent years chasing. Victoria encouraged him to expand aggressively and compete for contracts that would have seemed impossible when he and Sarah were starting out. But the company began spending faster than it was earning. Some of the contracts Michael accepted carried risks he might once have questioned. Important clients questioned the new direction. One long-term customer decided not to renew. Employees who had been with him for years began leaving. Investors started asking difficult questions. Michael responded by insisting that growth required risk. He borrowed more money. He committed to larger projects. But the numbers kept getting worse. The woman who once knew how to negotiate with suppliers, protect relationships, and question unnecessary expenses was no longer sitting beside him. Eventually the company needed a new supplier for a major contract, and Michael's team sent out requests for proposals. One immediately stood out. The pricing was competitive. The delivery schedule was realistic. The supplier had strong relationships with contractors and an unusually good record for completing orders on time. The executive responsible for reviewing the proposals brought it into Michael's office. "This company has everything we're looking for," he said. Michael barely looked up from his desk. He had been dealing with financial problems all morning. "What's the company called?" The executive answered, "Mitchell Solutions." Michael stopped breathing for a moment. He told himself there had to be another explanation. Mitchell was a common name. He picked up the proposal and began reading. The owner listed at the top was Sarah Mitchell. Michael stared at the page. The woman he had thrown out of their home 2 years earlier had built a company capable of competing for one of his most important contracts. The executive continued explaining why Mitchell Solutions was the strongest candidate, unaware of the history between Michael and the woman whose name appeared on the document. Michael leaned back in his chair. Sarah wasn't sitting at home grieving the life he had taken from her. She wasn't waiting for him to return. She had built something entirely separate from him. Then he remembered the words he had spoken when he threw her out. "You stopped being the woman I needed a long time ago." Now the woman he claimed he no longer needed was being recommended by his own executives as the best supplier they had found. And that was what made the moment so powerful. Sarah hadn't chased Michael. She hadn't plotted against him. She had simply become successful enough that his company could no longer ignore her. Michael asked his executive to arrange a meeting with the owner. He didn't tell anyone about their history. Sarah accepted without knowing why he wanted to see her. To her, it was another potential client on a busy calendar. The next morning, Michael arrived at Mitchell Solutions. Sarah's office wasn't the enormous headquarters he had built for himself. It was modern but modest. Employees moved through the lobby carrying files. There was no sign she had built the business to impress anyone. She had built it to work. Michael gave his name to the receptionist. A few minutes later, Sarah stepped out of her office. When she saw him, she stopped. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Sarah had imagined many possible versions of this moment. She had imagined anger. She had imagined tears. But standing there, looking at the man who had once been her entire world, she felt something she hadn't expected. Nothing. Not hatred. Not longing. Just distance. Michael looked at her and said, "Sarah, I need your help." Sarah held his gaze. "You came all this way to ask me that?" Michael nodded. He explained that his company was struggling with suppliers and that his team had recommended Mitchell Solutions as the strongest option. Sarah listened without interrupting. She didn't mention Victoria. She didn't mention the house. She didn't remind him that the company he was asking her to supply was the same one she had helped him build. She simply listened as a business owner evaluating a potential customer. When he finished, Sarah said, "I'll review the proposal." Michael seemed surprised by how calmly she responded. Perhaps he expected anger. Then, after a long silence, Michael said the words he had been avoiding for 2 years. "Sarah, I'm sorry." She looked at him. He continued. "I was wrong." Sarah didn't rescue him from the discomfort. She simply said, "You were." Michael lowered his eyes. He admitted that he had taken her loyalty for granted and confused her patience with weakness. He admitted that he had believed success meant he no longer needed the woman who had helped him get there. "I never understood what I had," he said. Sarah answered, "That's not my problem anymore." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. She had spent 2 years rebuilding herself. After Michael decided she wasn't valuable enough to remain in his life, she had no interest in becoming responsible for his regret. She could have rejected him. She could have told him he deserved everything that was happening. Instead, Sarah agreed to consider the contract with conditions. The relationship would be strictly professional. There would be no special treatment because of their history. Every payment, every delivery, and every dispute would follow the same standards her company used for everyone else. Michael agreed. There was no argument. Then Sarah said, "And one more thing." Michael waited. She told him the past would stay in the past. She wasn't interested in rebuilding their marriage. She wasn't interested in becoming his friend. She had built a life beyond all of that, and she wasn't going to let a contract pull her backward. Michael nodded slowly. For once, he didn't try to negotiate. 25 years earlier, Sarah had helped him negotiate his first supplier agreement because she believed in his future. Now he was sitting across from her, negotiating for the services of the company she had built without him. Michael was preparing to leave when Sarah stopped him. She reached beneath her desk and pulled out the small leather folder. Michael's eyes went to it immediately. "You still have that?" Sarah looked down at it. "I never had a reason to throw it away." He had seen her carrying it the night she left, but he had assumed it held old photographs. Sarah placed it on the desk between them and opened it slowly. Michael recognized some of the documents. Immediately, he picked up one of the old supplier agreements and looked at the date. It was from the year they had nearly lost everything. Sarah pointed to the handwritten notes along the side. "You remember this supplier?" Michael nodded. Sarah reminded him that the supplier had initially refused to work with them, and that Michael had been ready to walk away. She had spent hours negotiating until he finally agreed. Michael remembered the deal. What he didn't remember was how much Sarah had done to make it happen. She showed him another document. Then another. Sarah looked at him and said, "You always thought this was your company." Michael didn't answer. She turned a page. "But I was there before. The first office." Another page. "I was there before the first employee." Another. "I was there before the first million." Michael looked down at the documents again. He finally understood why Sarah's company had grown so quickly. She hadn't started from nothing. She had started with 25 years of experience she had never realized was hers to keep. The knowledge was still inside her. The relationships were still hers. The instincts were still hers. When she walked away from Michael, she hadn't lost those things. She had simply stopped using them for someone else. Sarah closed the folder halfway and looked directly at him. "I didn't take your company from you, Michael." She paused. "I simply stopped building it for you." Michael had no response. He could not change the night he had thrown her out. He could not erase Victoria. But standing there, he finally understood something he had failed to understand when they were married. Sarah had never been a burden standing beside his ambition. She had been part of the foundation beneath it. She placed the folder back inside the drawer. She didn't demand anything. She simply stood up and ended the meeting. 4. Sarah, the folder was no longer proof that she deserved recognition from Michael. It was proof that she had finally recognized herself. And Michael walked out carrying something he hadn't brought with him. Regret. Michael eventually recovered some of what he had lost. His company survived, although it was never quite the same. But there was one thing he could never recover. Sarah. She eventually forgave him, and forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. It didn't mean inviting him back into her home. It didn't mean forgetting the years she had spent wondering whether she was still enough for the man she loved. It simply meant Sarah refused to carry the weight of those memories for the rest of her life. She had already given Michael enough of her time. She wasn't going to give him her future. 2. She once believed that losing him meant losing the life she had built. But eventually she understood something far more important. She hadn't lost her life. She had finally gotten the chance to live it. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of everything that happened between them. Sometimes the ending you never wanted becomes the beginning you desperately needed. Sometimes the person who walks away from you creates the space for you to discover who you were before you became someone else's wife, someone else's partner, or someone else's support system. So now I want to ask you something. If you were Sarah, would you have helped Michael when he came back asking for help? Would you have accepted his apology? Or would you have walked away completely and never looked back? Tell me what you would have done in Sarah's position. I read the comments, and I genuinely want to hear your honest opinion. And if this story reminded you of someone who had to start over, someone who lost everything they thought they needed only to discover their own strength, share this story with them. Sometimes a person doesn't need someone to rescue them. Sometimes they simply need to remember that they are still capable of rebuilding. And if you enjoyed Sarah's story, don't leave just yet. Click on the next video on your screen and continue with us, because sometimes the person you underestimate becomes the person you regret losing the most. Sarah didn't win because Michael lost. She won because she stopped measuring her life by what Michael thought she was worth. She walked away from the house, but she never walked away from herself. Because in the end, Sarah didn't need Michael to admit that she mattered. She already knew. She didn't need him to regret losing her. She had already stopped regretting leaving him. And she didn't need the life they once planned. She had built something better. She had built a life that was finally hers.